Welcome to Clinical Lab Chat, part of the MedCore Podcast Network. I'm Chris Wolski, Director of Business Intelligence for CLP, and today I'll be speaking with David West and Lou Welebob about the biggest challenges facing clinical diagnostic labs today. David is CEO of Proscia, a software company advancing the way we understand diseases like cancer with digital pathology and AI solutions. So very cutting edge. And Lou is Vice President and General Manager of Pathology at Agilent, which provides solutions to improve the efficiency of clinical labs. So welcome David and Lou to Clinical Lab Chat. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you both about your takes on some of the biggest challenges in the diagnostic landscape today. So let's get to it. Let's get to it. So, all right. Certainly, COVID has dominated every aspect of our society. Lou and I were actually talking a little bit about that before we started recording this podcast, and particularly the way we access healthcare. Now, for David, we'll start with you. What do you think has been the biggest change to come out of the pandemic in relation to diagnostic testing? And Lou will follow up with you after David.
Yeah. I think there's two or three big things. First and foremost, for the world, it really put a spotlight on healthcare and diagnostics in particular for everyone.
Right.
We all went from not really thinking about what it takes, what goes into diagnostics, to in some cases bringing diagnostics right into our homes. It was kind of national news 24/7 for 2 years. The other thing that it did is it really forced the world to think about how we can use technology, not just to access healthcare, but to change every aspect of our lives. I mean, most of us are doing work via Zoom now today. It helps make the world a little bit smaller. And in many ways, we've seen that impact healthcare. For us in pathology, what I've seen is labs today, pathologists, lab leaders, etc., have leaned into the adoption of digital pathology as a product of COVID because it lets them access patients anywhere. It lets them access a global workforce of pathologists, and it makes the world of pathology a little bit smaller as well. So I think to see those two things converge is kind of the perfect storm for digital pathology, for the use of
Right.
Of this technology in a field that is so central to medicine and really took center stage for our lives for years.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. I've talked about this a little bit as well, that, so much of what we've taken diagnostic testing for granted. We go to your doctor's office, you get blood drawn, and then some magical, you get a report that magically happened somehow. So I think you're right. I think that spotlight is probably the biggest thing. Lou, for you, what has been a couple of the biggest changes that have come out of for diagnostic testing, particularly because of the pandemic? Now, we were talking about traveling a little bit, but let's stick to diagnostic labs for this conversation.
Sounds good, Chris. Yeah, so for me, what COVID-19 did was really thrust to the center where diagnostics really became the first line of defense. Okay, so Before we had vaccines, before we had, under full understanding of this disease, it became basically, let's get tested. Right. So that was that really put it at the forefront of testing in one of the first pandemic settings ever. Okay. So this was really that thrust that into the center of it. I think the second thing is we showed is how we can ramp testing when we need to. Okay. So again, the ability for laboratories worldwide to ramp. Okay. Because remember, it was all about not just having to test, but can we ramp? Can we get a test? Right. And I think I think COVID-19 shown us and taught us how we can actually, one, use this as a first line of defense, right? And two, how we can basically scale it. And then the third one is really how can we evolve it to make it more readily available to everybody?
Right.
This was a huge push toward, point of care test, toward the point of care testing and so forth, right? Which allowed the test to become taking the test closer to the patient as opposed
Right.
to going closer.
Right. Well, great. Well, you've rolled right into our next question. My next question for you, and Lou, I'll keep you on the hot seat for that then for this. So I've talked a lot about access and personnel shortages throughout in the magazine on this podcast. Let's put them together. How is the workforce shortage of both technologists and pathologists affecting access to testing, particularly now that there's so much better understanding of how important testing is, and in light of some of the things you just talked about, Lou? So put those two things together: access and the tech shortage, and how are they related, and how are we coping with that because of some of these changes?
So the first one is like around tech shortage. So
Right.
I think this is not the first industry to see a shortage of technicians.
Of course not. Yeah, for sure.
However, what you see is when you start seeing the shortage of technicians, that's where automation comes in. Okay, so automated platforms like we have here at Agilent, automated platforms for pathology testing, and other companies do as well. That automation really rises to the top. And even if you start to see more send outs of laboratories to say more centralized testing, the automation still is in play at those large laboratories where this is happening. But just getting the test performed is just one part of the equation. The next part of the equation, is how do we interpret it, right?
Right.
That's where basically, we look at what's happening in the pathology world today, and we're now with the pandemic, which has pushed telepathology further.
Right.
Now we start to see where digital pathology really is coming into play, because you can run the test on the automated platform, but you still have to interpret it, and so there's a level of interpretation that is further enabled, okay, through digitization. And then, of course, digitization brings more algorithm assist type for the ultimate interpretation. So this is what we see really has happened, and that really it was there before the pandemic, but we've seen it driven further since the pandemic, right?
Right.
That's how laboratories seem to be dealing with, scaling, okay, but also scaling through interpretation by the use of these two technologies of automation and then digitization.
All right. David, for you, from your perspective, what about the relationship with access and technician shortage and some of the things that Lou's talking about with automation? I know we've talked a little bit about some of those things in the past.
When I talk to lab leaders today, they are keenly aware of in some cases, talent war that they're in. In order to run their business, they need to access great talent.
Right.
And patients are everywhere. Patients are not just in, I'm sitting here in Philadelphia in a major hub, but that's not where patients are exclusively. They're everywhere.
Right.
And in many ways, pathology has been a brick and mortar discipline for its entire history, but that's starting to change. And so lab leaders are looking at this and saying, how can I lean into this technology to create new advantages that allow me to attract talent anywhere, and maybe be able to go after a broader customer base, if you're a private laboratory,
right?
Which is a whole other side of the equation. But as it relates to the workforce shortage, I think what you're seeing here is that these labs now have a new tool in solving that talent challenge. That doesn't make it go away entirely, but in a world where the number of pathologists relative to the cancer burden is decreasing, and where pathology is an increasingly complex and subspecialized field, you want to be able to tap into a global talent pool, or at least a national talent pool, depending on what kind of organization you are.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, that also brings up another issue: reimbursement. And I know, David, that's your area in a large part. And now that's also certainly likely the bane of most of our listeners, particularly our laboratory managers and directors. Can you give an overview of the reimbursement landscape in 2023? Now, certainly, for example, the COVID tests, they're not reimbursement. I just had to do one for a trip, actually, not too long ago. I had to pay for it. It was not inexpensive. So how do you recommend? So that landscape is changing a little bit then, what it was just a few months ago or a year ago. So how do you recommend that these our lab directors and lab manager listeners optimize, in some cases, a shrinking or at least constrained resource in terms of reimbursement? Because certainly if people have to pay for certain tests out of pocket, they're not going to get them. So how do they cope with that and this renewed reimbursement landscape?
I think Lou probably has the best 360 degree.
Okay, well, Lou, why don't you jump?
What I will say
Okay.
is that as it relates to Proscia's world of digital pathology, I think one of the really notable things to come out of the last, whatever it was, year and a half or 2 years, was a material change in the reimbursement framework for digital pathology. So now there's tracking codes.
Right.
And that lets lets payers start to get a sense for what digital pathology adoption and impact looks like. And it lets laboratories, in a sense, get credit for what they're doing in digital pathology. So labs are just starting to adopt that, and it's still a new phenomenon, and it sets the foundation for new technologies to be able to be built on top of this image-based paradigm that could potentially be candidates for reimbursement, companion diagnostics,
Right.
et cetera.
Right.
So that's what we're seeing in this space.
Okay. Well, Lou, why don't you give us that big picture then?
So lab economics is really, the challenge today, right? So
right.
It's really a challenge. It's a reimbursement challenge, but it's also overall lab economics challenge.
Right.
So the laboratories are being asked to do more with less, right? And in the meantime, there's still patients on the other end of the testing that's counting on the result. And so,
right.
as you start to work through this, some of the biggest challenges to the laboratory is really getting paid for the tests that they run, right?
Right.
So this is still a struggle. And some of the more recent legislation that's come out, such as PAMA and now the SALSA Act, and then we're all looking as vendors to the Ballot Act, right?
Yeah.
So the legislation is actually getting a bit heavier, but also every time there's new legislation, it seems like there's some reimbursement that leaves the equation, and so it makes
right.
it more difficult for the patient, but also for the laboratory. When you start to think about it, as David mentioned, there's new codes available now for this new technology with digital pathology, scanning, so forth, right? So the reimbursement is coming up there. I think the key thing that we're looking at, in Agilent is how do we look at this, right, from a holistic perspective, from an entire test perspective, right? So the test gets ordered, right? Test gets ordered and the test gets run, okay? But then as you start thinking through the reimbursement of that, how is the value of the test enhanced through digital pathology? And so when you start thinking through that, as far as like enhancement of that value, now it starts to become somewhat easier to make the cases, including with outcomes, to make the cases to the agencies for reimbursement, to make sure that they're seeing what's happening at the laboratory level. And so this is an opportunity to not decrease reimbursement, but to look at how reimbursement could be increased based on basically the new technology and the advantages that it's bringing to the patient and to patient care. And I think that's where this all sits right now. And I think this is something that we as providers of tests, but also working closely with reimbursement and reimbursement providers, that we actually are working together in sync to make sure that we are making sure that this new technology is getting its fair share of reimbursement,
right,
so that it can come to the market in a way that can be more adoptable by laboratories.
Right. Well, that's always kind of the two-edged sword too, because you have maybe a very effective test. You've shown it's proven to be effective. Maybe you've gotten regulatory approval in some regards, and then now you have to get that reimbursement part of it. One's always seems to be trailing behind the other, and that seems to be really the biggest headache, no matter what area of healthcare you're in, that are trying to get that reimbursement in a way that makes the best sense for everyone involved, both for the organization, so you're making some money, and also for the, as you mentioned, Lou, the patient. Because really, ultimately it's about the patient, because the patient needs those tests, particularly if there's good turnaround time or they're very effective and can help lead to resolution of their issues, their condition.
I
So
think on the other side of it, like there's also movement. We see this movement to bring agencies, like the
right,
US FDA and CMS kind of together, right? So that
right,
that you can actually have the reimbursement when this new test is released, so that you're not now having to go and say, oh, now I have to go get the reimbursement after I've got my
yeah,
regulatory approval. But I think we see this in the United States where they really are working. The legislation is working to bring these things together, and I think the more that occurs, the better it will be for the lab, better it will be for the patient.
yeah. Oh, that's great. That's terrific. Well, I know that Proscia and Agilent have just announced a distribution agreement, so congratulations. So what's on the horizon for both for you both as partners? So Lou, I'll keep you on the hot seat. So what's on the horizon with this partnership, and then David, we can talk about from your perspective.
Yeah. First of all, we are very excited to have partnered with Proscia. This has been, a great fit between two great companies, and we see Proscia as really, in many ways, leading the way into the market in the area of digital pathology. Okay, so we really feel like the agnostic approach that Proscia has taken and that we've taken at Agilent really is part of that, where we can meet the laboratory where they are in their digital pathology journey, and by being agnostic, by allowing the purchase protection that they have from what they've already bought, while still basically adding to that so that they can gain a more full digital experience. We also see this as really important to our end-to-end solution, right? So our end-to-end solution, from the standpoint of reagents to the testing, through to our staining automation technologies, right? By coupling this now with a strong digital pathology offering, we really can offer a much more extensive portion of the end-to-end solution to do all the great things that we just spoke about in the earlier part of this podcast, for automation, as well as how we actually work with the lab on laboratory economics.
All right, and David, what about Proscia? What's your perspective on this partnership?
Yeah, I may be kind of stealing Lou's words, but we are incredibly excited as well. This is a really great coming together of, a company which, in our position as Proscia, we're a software company.
Right.
And this lets us focus on building world-class software. But what Agilent brings is global distribution and that end-to-end solution that's still backed by that open platform approach. And I think for the customers, that's so important, because labs want digital pathology to be something that's easy to adopt, that can be flexible for them to adopt, as Lou pointed out. And part of that ease of adoption is these customers have great relationships with Agilent. Agilent is a worldwide leader in diagnostics and pathology. And so that makes Agilent such a great partner for us, because it helps us get our software to customers where they are, and for that to be part of a broader end-to-end solution.
Great. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the agnostic part of that. I think that's really interesting, because I've covered different parts of healthcare. I've covered other industries where things start out, either software or whatever technology starts out as this very proprietary sort of approach, and then it ends up becoming more of an open platform and agnostic, and it really benefits. It really benefits everybody, no matter what industry. It's so interesting whenever I've done this, and I've seen like this proprietary journey to an open platform or an agnostic platform. Lou, can you talk a little bit more about the benefits of, just more in terms of that concept of the open platform or that agnostic platform, the benefits for the labs, for people, for Agilent, people like you, and certainly for the patients?
Sure. So in the laboratories today, pathology laboratories today, there's no such thing as a one vendor all solution. Okay?
Right.
So that doesn't exist, right? So
Right.
So today you see in the pathology laboratories where they choose solutions from various vendors, okay, And we have to interoperate with each other's platforms today, right?
Right.
And so that's no different than when we're extending this now to digital pathology, where we need to basically make sure that we're interoperating, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and also, again, so that one, it's not just about, it's about already solutions that have been chosen in the laboratories. How do we work with those solutions as opposed to making the laboratory go out and buy an entire, complete brand new end-to-end solution? All right, so that investment protection is really important. And then also, they've made that investment, and so that investment isn't just in the hardware or in the software, but it's also in the training of the laboratory and their laboratory workflow, right? So the bigger
Right.
changes are actually to the laboratory workflow. And so we always look at this from having a flexible set of solutions, and flexibility now also means, making sure that we maintain that agnostic approach as we enter into digital pathology as well.
Okay, great.
One thing that I've noticed is every lab is different,
Right.
and even within a laboratory, they might need a handful of very high throughput, high volume scanners, high capacity scanners. They might need at one of their satellite locations a smaller footprint, lower throughput scanner. Right? There's a lot of kind of permutations of what this can look like, and that's something that we've always tried to bake into our approach as a software company, is to be able to support that varied landscape, and that's great for customers, and we've seen it's great for laboratories, and we've seen how they've been able to adopt this technology, and every year there's more opportunities, options for them to consider when going digital. Lou talked a lot about investment protection. That future proofing aspect is so important,
Yeah.
and it's especially important in a time when the sort of analysis and AI applications that can live on top of this new modality is growing very, very quickly. We've seen this explode in the research world. And now some of these technologies are starting to get approved for diagnostic use. We're going to see more of that over the next few years. And we want customers to be able to tap into all of those technologies today and tomorrow whenever they come out. So
Great.
that's part of the open solution as well.
Yeah.
As a software company, for us, we have to look at both sides of that.
Right.
Laboratory wants scanners. How can we support different scanners? Laboratory wants different AI applications. How can we support AI applications?
Right.
70% of the labs that we work with use our API to integrate third-party or homegrown AI applications
Right.
on top of our platform.
Right.
That level of flexibility is really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's so critical. I mean, this off-the-shelf kind of approach just doesn't work. As you said, David, every lab is different. Every organization I've ever worked for, and in my world, there's some similarities, but a lot of differences as well. So yeah, you bring up a great point there. So now, one thing I always like to do with when I talk about big picture things like that, I always like to have the guests pull out their crystal ball or tea leaves or whatever it is that they use to foresee the future. And I want to talk a little about the future. So the COVID emergency declaration is going to be ending soon. So again, it kind of goes back to what we started with. So what's the next big challenge diagnostic labs are going to face in the next 3 to 5 years? And I think we've touched on maybe a couple of them. David, why don't you go first and talk about that?
We have touched on a couple of them. We've touched on things like workforce, reimbursement, and I will say, digitization in its own right, while a lot of labs have been really successful, it's a challenge to do that. Right?
Yeah.
They have to think about transforming IT. They have to think about transforming their operations. They have to think about change management at pathologist and lab staff level. There's a lot of things that have to go on, and we're still in the first inning of that transformation journey. Innovative labs have leaned into this really well and been super successful, and you can see the ROI that they're talking about. You can see the innovative edge that they're getting. You can see how that's impacting growth. So more labs are they now have a blueprint to follow. They have a roadmap, and I think big picture, when I take a step back, maybe less so a challenge, but more of an opportunity that I get really excited about. Something like, let's call it 1 billion slides created for diagnostic purposes every year, give or take whatever it might be, 10 or 20%, something like that. And if we were to digitize all of those slides, each of those slides is a gigabyte of information, about 1 billion pixels, telling some story about a patient's cancer or other disease, would otherwise be sitting on a shelf on a piece of glass collecting dust, um, doing nothing for us. That is a lot of data that puts labs in the driver's seat of a massive transformation that's happening in the world right now. Labs are increasingly data-driven organizations, and I think one of the challenges that they have to navigate as they're going digital is how do they use that data-driven paradigm to their advantage?
Yeah.
It opens up a lot of new possibilities for that, from efficiency to quality to innovation to being at the forefront of research in medicine. And I think that creates a more connected healthcare ecosystem. That's one of the things that I'm really excited about, and one of the things that I think labs ought to be excited about. And the ones that have gone digital are realizing what that opportunity is.
Right. Okay, great. And Lou, for you, what does your crystal ball say about the challenges, the big challenges we should be looking at in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges to face today is, getting more actionable information out of a sample. So this is really important, okay? Because you often have one shot at this, right? To get the information you need,
right,
to provide the prognosis or diagnostic to the patient. So today, with so many different technologies and techniques around, you have to choose wisely what technique and technology you're going to use to get the most information out of patient samples. So that's one thing at the testing and the patient level. The second thing that I hear frequently is scalability, okay, especially in the United States laboratories, their ability to scale, and you brought it up earlier, the lack of technicians, the lack of pathologists, right? How to continue to scale that laboratory, right? Because again, the scaling of the laboratory also means, how is the economics working, right?
Right.
And so in order to basically keep up with, maybe a downward trend in reimbursement, right, the laboratories have to run more specimens, more samples to keep up with that, and that's where that scalability comes in.
Right.
So I think this is going to be their continuous challenge, is through scalability. But this is where I also think that, more digitization, is certainly part of the answer to that equation.
Well, great. Thanks to you both. And with that, we'll call it a day. And thanks again for both of you to take time to speak with me today. Lou's in Copenhagen, so it's the end of your day. So I hope you have a good evening. And David, I think you're looking at the back end of yours. I think we had a great conversation, lots of food for thought. Let's not wait 3 years to find out if we're right. So we can talk. I hope we could talk again soon. And I also want to thank our laboratory audience for listening. As always, look for more episodes of Clinical Lab Chat in the future, and visit us online at clpmag.com and on all of the major social media platforms. So until next time.